Hello, friends and enemies, heroes and villains. Welcome to Epic Realms. Today's guest is an accomplished author with multiple series of sci-fi and fantasy novels. He's the author of the newest D&D novel, SpellJammer Memories Wake. That's going to be available Tuesday, June 4th. Please welcome Django Wexler to Epic Realms. Thank you for joining us today.
Hi, thanks for having me. Glad to be here.
I'm really curious because you've done a lot of things and it's kind of bounced around a little bit, and I'm very curious kind of how this journey took place. If you want to kind of start us off, because I know you kind of did some tabletop role playing in high school, you
Oh
enjoyed
man,
kind of the
the
fantasy
journey of
genre. Tell us about you as a kid growing up and kind of how you got into
that
that genre, and were you a writer at that time as well?
that's a long story, but the gist of it is no, I started out as a role-playing gamer first and foremost. So I started out playing D&D when I was like 11 or 12. I have character sheets from my Spelljammer campaign back then, which are a little embarrassing nowadays, but it's really funny. Um, and But especially in high school, we had a really good RPG group in my hometown, and I played a lot of RPGs. It's almost unfathomable to me now the hours that I put in. I mean, we would do 2 or 3 nights a week for 6 or 7 hours at a time. Um, and the rest of the time was like reading books and doing other stuff. It's like that was my life when I was 17. Um, and I kind of got into writing. I've always been like a DM slash GM in tabletop
Okay.
RPGs. I've always It's just always been where I gravitated to, and I kind of got into writing because it got a little frustrating trying to do the stories I wanted to do in the relatively low bandwidth world of role-playing games.
Yeah.
I think in retrospect, I just wanted to do more like book type stuff. Um, at the time, I'm not sure I understood the difference between what's a book story and what's an RPG story. I
Yeah.
probably do better at that now. And then also I graduated and left for high school and left for college, just meant a different group and different circumstances. So that's kind of when I started writing, was about the end of high school. Um, and I kept playing RPGs in college. I played a lot of D&D through the 3 and 3.5 era. Um, and then But I kept writing fiction too. And I did some fan fiction, and then I finally sold some books. Um, and so now, ironically, writing a D&D novel is a thing that like 18-year-old me would be completely freaking out about.
Yeah.
But like I
Yeah.
haven't actually been in a serious D&D campaign for probably 10 years.
Okay. Okay.
So it's kind of, you know,
Did you read D&D novels back then as well?
oh yeah. I have on my shelf the 6 original Spelljammer novels,
Okay.
which uh, you know, are a nostalgia trip. I haven't gone back to read them actually because my guess is the quality is a little mixed. Like
Right.
they got a different author for each one, which is a little weird for an ongoing series.
Yeah.
And so like I recall not liking all of them even at the time, but it's definitely a blast from the past.
Yeah, I think they did that for like the Ravenloft books as well, where they were like, here's the thing, and then they changed to another author, but it's got the same characters. You never
Yeah,
really know.
it's a weird because for R.A. Salvatore still was doing and is still doing all the
Yeah,
Drizzt stuff.
yeah.
Um, it, but and Weiss and Hickman were doing all the Dragonlance stuff.
Hmm.
I don't know. I didn't have any association with WotC, or I guess it's still TSR back then.
Yeah, it was. Yeah,
This is pre-WotC.
yeah, for
Uh,
sure.
and so, but anyway, once I started having a writing career, um, my agent uh, would sort of poke around for work for hire opportunities to kind of fill
Okay,
out my schedule.
okay.
And
That's
I ended up doing some magic story for
yeah,
Wizards of the Coast. And
yeah.
that
I
one
want to
pretty
get to that here in a bit. Um,
okay.
when you're so you're growing up, you're in high school. Did role playing and writing, did that get in the way of your academics at all, or was it like hand in hand? Did they help each other out?
Um, I was very good results wise in
Okay.
academics. I always got good grades. I did not work very hard. Um, all through high school, my teachers were telling me, "Oh, you're just coasting, I guess because you're smart, but someday you'll get into the real world." Or they would say, "You get to college and you won't be able to do that anymore. You have to learn to work really hard." And then, like, in college, they said that about the real world, and it's even less true of the real world than it is of. Um,
Right.
so the answer is I didn't do very much work in high school, and so I had plenty of free time for RPGs.
Okay. Okay. What? So,
I am not a role model, kids. Do your homework.
well, that's just the thing. I always think to myself that no matter what the guest's experience in past life is, right? There's always a story. There's always a message there of something along the lines of like, if you did awesome, then that's great. Maybe it helps people to learn that they need to do awesome and work at it. Sometimes they don't, and they don't do well at the beginning, and then they have to work hard later, and they make it. There's so many different paths to get where an author is, a game designer is. There's so many paths, so everybody has an option, and I always love that because it's unique for everybody. And so for me, like that's really cool.
I mean, I would actually argue maybe my message should be kids don't do your homework because like the work I did on D&D and writing is obviously like very important to my career now, which is how I make a living,
Right.
and much more so than anything I learned in school. Um, but I wouldn't bet the farm on it.
Yeah. What you said, you went to college. What did you go to college for? What was your, did you get
Um,
degrees or multiple
yeah,
things or?
my training is as a computer scientist, right? I thought my life was going to be I was going to be a software engineer with kind of a hobby. Um, I actually have a double degree in computer science and creative writing, but only because we had a required minor in, and so I did creative writing, and then getting the major was actually really easy. It was only a few more classes, so I just
Okay.
did it. But it was not part of my life plan. I figured, I'd write some books and maybe someday I'd make a little bit of money at it, but I wouldn't, I wasn't going to count on it for a living.
Yeah.
And indeed, I was at Carnegie Mellon in Pittsburgh. And so I worked there after graduation for the Defense Department, for DARPA, doing AI research for a few years. And then I moved here to Seattle to work for Microsoft for a few years. Um, and so it wasn't until I had sold some books and I was like, I'm making as much money from this as I am from Microsoft, and I like this a lot better. So
Yeah. Yeah.
I started doing this full time.
When people say, I use a term like software engineer, what does that, what does that mean? Because you hear the term a lot, but really, what is it? Like, what does that entail?
Um, that's getting into territory that I'm like no longer up on the terminology for. I
Right.
know what it meant in 2003,
What did it mean in
but
2003?
that was a
We'll
long
reword the
time ago.
question.
In
In your
2000
time, what did it mean?
in 2003, it was we were starting to get to the point where people wanted to make it known that writing software was no longer just like one guy sits down and just types code out until the software is done. Um, I mean, it was never really that, but like that was the popular perception. And
Right.
so, like, the idea of like software engineers was to have like a kind of higher tier of work that was about architecting and, you know, managing other people and stuff like that. It's changed over the years. I think software engineering generally refers to kind of a higher, not so much the actual nitty-gritty of like getting code that gets things done, but the kind of next meta level up of like how to organize um, software at a kind of organizational level.
Hmm.
If that makes any sense. But it's changed. There are a lot of fads in software engineering and like different methodologies, and they're all basically voodoo. Um, like the secret is that like all that stuff is kind of bullshit and we all know it, but like kind of go along with it because it impresses people. Um,
So from your time doing and I have to ask this just because of the way that the world is right now.
oh, go ahead.
You did some work with AI. What is your thoughts on the way it's progressed from then to now?
Yeah. I mean, so first of all, the actual technical side of what I did is all completely out of date. The
Yeah,
stuff we worked with was, we were essentially trying to make like basically Siri, but with the technology available in 2003, it was just
right.
not possible.
Yeah.
Like we just didn't have the compute, didn't have a whole bunch of other structural things that we needed to make that work. Um, so it was interesting, but I used to refer to myself as a professional waste of taxpayer dollars. Um, the the really fascinating thing for me, I mean, basically, my position on modern AI is like it's interesting, and you can definitely see some utility for some kinds of work, like um, good search over heterogeneous data is really interesting. Like
Yeah.
if I'm like I'm a big company and I have 70 years of financial records going back from the days like the earliest parts are on microfiche and it's in 17 different data formats.
Right.
The idea that you can just kind of train an AI on all of that and just sort of crush it into this one format and then ask the AI, okay, get me this page of our financial records from 1974.
Yeah.
Like that's really interesting,
Yeah.
um, and potentially useful. But that's like not the thing that has gotten the hype.
I know.
I think the hyped stuff is like either fake or not interesting or both. Um, it's the I'm trying to think. I'm trying to be accurate here because I know people will yell at me. But
Well, yeah. It's
but
as far as you understood it at the time.
yeah, the big problems are things like copyright. These AI companies have basically just trained their machines on all the information in the whole world and on the expectation that if your crime is big enough, then they have to let you get away with it. And
Yeah.
so personally, I don't think they should be allowed to get away with it.
Right. For
And if
sure.
that destroys them, then so be it.
Yeah.
Um, but also, I don't, I think they are vastly understating the cost, the financial cost of what they're currently doing.
Yeah.
All these companies are losing an enormous amount of money, um, burning money to try to get to some sort of like capture of all of us,
Yeah.
uh, and I don't think they'll get there. Give it another 9 or 10 months, and I think we will have an AI bust the way we had a dot-com bust,
Yeah.
which is
I
like
agree.
there's something real there. Like obviously, many companies that came through the dot-com bust have gone on to become Amazon and Google,
Right.
or
Right.
Google was post, um, but most of what was currently the new hotness in 1999 is gone now. I think that will be true of the AI companies as well, because they are essentially living on investment capital.
Yeah. You had
Um,
mentioned moving, you eventually were like, "Hey, I'm starting to do better with this book thing," right?
yeah.
What was kind of your foot in the door? Like, did you like write a book and then shop around and be like, "Hey, who wants to take my book?" Or did somebody
Yep.
come to you, or did it like short stories and eventually gain traction?
Very traditional methods. So when I went to college, they were still telling you like, oh, you should write short stories and sell them to magazines, but that advice is like horribly out of date. Like that was true in 1975. It's not true now. Hasn't been true for like 40 years because short fiction magazines sadly have are not what they once were. There
Right.
are a few really great ones left, but there used to be hundreds, even in SFF alone, which has always been my field. So I wrote a bunch of fan fiction. I wrote some novels and sold them to a small press publisher, which went okay. They kind of disappeared without a trace. And then I was like, okay, I'm gonna write a new book. because I'm always writing something. And I said, this time I'm going to sell it to a real publisher. So it took me a long time to write it. And then when I did, I just did the old fashioned way. I got lists of agents and I sent out queries. Um, back in those days, we had physical books of agents, which is
Right.
like unfathomable to me now. You just like buy this giant tome and then I guess throw it away because it's no longer accurate in a couple of years.
Right.
Um, and I queried, I don't know, 50, 60 agents and got a couple of responses and ended up picking one. And he sold the book to Penguin,
Okay.
or to Ace Rock, rather.
Yeah. Which is, I mean, technically, it's associated with Penguin, right?
Well, because this was before the PRH merger, and I have to adjust all my terminology. Like,
Oh, okay, okay, okay.
um,
So did they find editors for you? Did you find get your own editors, artists,
uh,
cover art, all of that kind of stuff?
oh yeah, yeah, yeah. So the way it works, and still worked then and still works now, is when you're pitching to TradPub, first you get an agent because most TradPub won't take unagented submissions. They don't have the bandwidth. So you get a literary agent, and the literary agent sends it around to different editors. And the editors at TradPub are the ones who pick the books, basically. They the editor is essentially an executive, and so they, in addition to like literally being an editor, um, so once you've sold your book to someone, they usually have to get approval from a publisher, but ultimately they're the one who makes the call to buy the book. Um, then they're the one who will be editing you usually. Sometimes there's assistants or other, gets farmed out to other people. Um, and then they do all the like work of doing publishing, getting cover art together, doing editing, doing copy editing, doing um typesetting and proofreading, and all that stuff is in their bailiwick, which is very nice. My wife does more stuff on the self-pub side, and it's a lot of work. There's a lot of
Right.
non-writing work, like a lot more than you'd think if you're not in that world.
Yeah.
So it makes me appreciative of it. Appreciate.
So you get published with Rock. What was your initial reaction when they picked you up? Because here's a company, talking about a person who's a role player. Here's a company that was, doing shadow run books, right? And I'm assuming, being the sci-fi beat person that you are, that you were a little bit into Shadowrun at least, or did you at least know of Shadowrun?
Surprisingly not. Shadowrun kind of passed me by.
Okay,
I've read a couple of the rule books since then, but I was never a Shadowrun guy. I was into D&D. We did Rifts, the
okay,
Palladium RPG, um, and a few others. I kind of nudged some of the World of Darkness stuff, although I never really got into it.
yeah,
Um, Shadowrun always seemed really cool, but I just never had a group for it,
okay,
at those books. Uh, but yeah, it was super exciting. Obviously, that's tempered somewhat by the fact that everything takes forever.
yeah,
Like it was probably 18 months from the point at which, we signed the deal to the point at which the book actually came out.
right,
And that's like not unusual at all. So it's one of those things where like you get really excited and you're like, yeah, for a few days you're like on top of the world, but then like you can't maintain that because like nothing happens
yeah,
for weeks. Um, and then the odd thing is, by the time the book actually comes out, and once again you're like, "Ooh, I'm so excited," but at that point the book feels like ancient history
yeah,
because like you've already moved on. Like
yeah,
I had already written the sequel to my first book by the time the first one came out. And so uh people start asking you about your book and you're like, fuck, I gotta remember all the things I was doing a
right,
year and a half ago that have already been sort of purged from my brain.
yeah. And that we're talking the Thousand Names book, yes?
Uh-huh. That was my first sort of big publisher book. There's Memories of Empire and Shinigami are two books that I wrote prior to that came out with a small press that I think no longer exists. Um, but that was kind of the beginning of my traditional writing career.
Okay,
That, and shortly afterwards, the Forbidden Library for kids.
Yeah, yeah, I was going to ask about that. Real quick, what is the plan? Do you have more books in that series planned to come out? Are you pretty much done with that series? I know a lot of people are. I've
Which
seen
series?
always be
Thousand
clamoring for
Names.
the Shadow Campaign series.
Oh,
People seem to always be like, "Is there going to be another one? Is there another one?" So I'm going to ask you, is there going to be another one?
there are currently no plans for
Okay.
there to be another one. If somebody dropped a giant bag of money on my desk and said, write another one, I wouldn't say no.
Right,
But at the moment, it's not in the cards. I have so many things that I want to write. I have so much cool stuff that I want to
right.
do, like different worlds I want to work on. The staying in one past the end of the story is not super attractive.
Yeah,
Um, and people it's natural when people really like the characters that they always want more
right.
stuff,
Yeah,
but sometimes it's not good to give it to them. Um, this has happened in a few like big franchises. I don't want to name names, but
yeah,
like often a character who's like fun in small doses as a side character, then like that character gets super popular and then they give them their own story and it turns out to be kind of unbearable.
yeah.
Um, and so like sometimes it's best to leave well enough alone.
Right, for sure. Well, you mentioned the Forbidden Library.
Hmm.
How was it for you to shift, because a lot of people they stay in one wheelhouse, right? This
Hmm.
age category, this genre, this is my wheelhouse, period, end of subject. And then so you shift, age categories to the Forbidden Library. What was that like for you? Was that easy? Was it difficult? Was it a challenge as far as, publishing goes?
It's it's a little tricky. The actual writing of it gets a little tricky. Um, but like mostly that's a place where I relied more on an editor where like, I'd write stuff and I really don't like writing like down to kids, so I tried not to. And then sometimes the editor will be like, this is, this language is too hard, like it's not gonna work for the target audience.
Right.
Um, and then you leave out certain topics, obviously, but like um it wasn't too bad. The publishing side was pretty easy. I had written this as just kind of a break from the sort of big military fantasies. I wrote this sort of little portal fantasy. Partly because it's so much shorter that it's kind of a relief. Like Thousand Names is like 200,000 words long, and Forbidden Library is only about 60 or 70,000 words. And
Right.
so um, you get to the point where in Thousand Names you're kind of like really getting into the meat of the story, and then with the kids book you're done.
Yeah.
Um, and so that always felt like kind of a relief. It's also just not as complicated. It's like a single point of view, straight line, no complicated flashbacks or
Yeah.
uh, multiple points of view trading off. Um, so largely it was okay. I just didn't have a lot of experience with middle grade, either writing it obviously or reading it. My editor once, I was kind of like a precocious reader, and middle grade as a category didn't really exist in the same way it does today.
Yeah.
So my editor would tell me like, well, just think about the books you read when you were 12. And I'm like, you mean like Dune? Like, like, that's what I was reading when I was 12.
Right.
It's kind of turned me loose in the library. Um, and that made it a little hard, but we got there.
Yeah.
The editors corrected me when I did something that the 12-year-olds weren't going to guess. Even then, though, like a lot of people underestimate kids and want things to be too simple than they really need to be, more
Right.
simple than they really need to be.
What about the crossover between fiction, fantasy and science fiction? Because you do some science
Mhm.
fiction as well. Was
I
that an
do.
easy shift for you, or was that like just like, oh, maybe not so much? One's a little bit different, and you had to like get into the mindset.
I've done only a little bit of science fiction to date, although I think my next series is going to be science fiction. It took me, for some reason, I have like higher standards for my own science fiction than anyone else's. I'm like, oh, I want things to make sense and to the world designed to make sort of scientific sense.
Yeah.
Um, and I don't really demand that from other people. So it took me a while to be like, I don't really need like That I'm not actually interested in writing like super hard science fiction, so I don't need to demand that of myself.
Hmm.
So getting over that took a little effort. Otherwise, not really. The two genres are very similar. Um, and you know, trying to draw the like very fine distinction is always sort of stupid. You just end up in these endless debates that don't really resolve anything. And so, um, yeah, largely it wasn't too hard.
Okay. When you're building these stories, especially like with the science fiction, do you think your background in computers and whatnot kind of plays a role in the development of some of the science fiction stuff because you have a lot more technical knowledge of computers and
It,
technology and stuff like that?
probably yes. I mean, almost certainly yes. I have a lot of computer stuff. There's also just a lot of history. I became kind of a history buff in post college, and I've just read a lot of books. I'm not a historian. I don't not anything academic on the subject, but I am pretty well read. And a lot of that also finds its way in. Those are my sort of two big nonfiction concentrations that get into books.
Okay.
History is probably actually more useful for fiction than computers. But yeah, there's definitely in the science fiction side, there's some more computer stuff.
Okay. How much do you think that your background in games, board games, video game, maybe, you know, tabletop role playing, miniature gaming, how much do you think that that stuff also plays into your storytelling?
Oh, a ton. It's all over it. That's just kind of how I started out framing my stories. Like the most obvious example is the way I approach world building,
Yeah.
is definitely as a sort of D&D GM approaching world building. Um, Kind of starting from the laws of magic and then laying out the continents and drawing maps on graph paper, all that stuff that DMs do is very much the way I approach things. Um, and that kind of thing is all over the place. I'm trying to think of another concrete example. But that approach, that kind of like role-playing game approach to designing
Yeah.
characters, and thinking about their capabilities and sort of strengths and weaknesses is very, all authors have to do this in some way or another, but the kind of
Right.
metaphor that shapes my thinking is very much
You build a
tabletop
whole
RPG.
complex background that nobody but you ever knows is there.
Exactly.
You
No,
hope the
well,
players
and
ask about it, but they never go there.
exactly, right? And like, to be honest, like the reason I started writing fiction was because I got sick of that, right? Because the players kept not doing the thing I wanted them to do. I alluded to this earlier, but the problem is that when you're DMing, it's a very kind of low bandwidth channel. It's really easy for people to miss things. And of course, all the players have their own things going on, and so they're not always like just like ready to jump into whatever plot you want them to jump into. Um, and so if you're trying to convey like a really complicated plot, it's really easy to for it to not even just go off the rails, but to like essentially be ignored. Um, we also, back in my formative days when we were playing Rifts, first of all, the Rifts world and rule set is just kind of bonkers. It has a very varied rule set, but also we couldn't control exactly who would show up for each session, and we just sort of subbed in, whatever whoever was there.
Mhm.
And so it'd be like if you were, trying to tell a fantasy story and you started out with like Raistlin and Caramon and Tasselhoff, and then like in chapter 2 with no explanation, we've subbed in Tasselhoff for a dragon and Caramon for like a giant mech with plasma missiles. And that's just like our game. And we just have to go on as though nothing had happened. And it kind of got frustrating to me after a while. I have all these books of backstory that I wrote for D&D campaigns and Rift campaigns long past.
Have any of
And
those
sadly,
characters or anything that you did? Do they make cameos in any of your books?
I've pillaged a few bits here and there for sure. Names, coming up with names is the worst part of being an author, so I'm always stealing
Right.
them from old books. There's actually a
And the worst
character.
thing about GMing too sometimes.
Yeah, people care less when you're GMing, in my experience. When you're doing fiction, there's always somebody, who's gonna like Google it. It's terrible. It can be terrible. Terry Pratchett has a whole riff about like how names mean different things, and so like that if you're just sort of picking syllables at random, the chance of hitting something that has some meaning in some language,
Right.
and then those people write you angry letters is like really annoying. At least when you're DMing, I guess this isn't true if you're streaming, but if you're just DMing for your friends, you at least kind of know their context,
Right.
and
Right.
make something up, then like you know who is going to be interpreting it, and it's not somebody on the other side of the world.
Right. That's funny. You mentioned, going through during the process and like I'm going to write out a map and draw a map. When you have something like that, do you send it out to the book creators and be like, "Here, get an artist to do a different version of this or whatever," or do you just kind of hope that they put something together?
No, we definitely I send it to the creators, or they ask me for one.
Okay.
In Thousand Names, if you look at those maps that are in the front of the books, those are all done from I'm terrible with a pencil, so everything I produce looks awful. Um, and so some professional artist, his name is in there. It has escaped me. Produced all that, and that's true for any of my books that have a map. It's almost always something I sketched out that looked like a 5-year-old did it, and then someone went in and made it look nice, which is great, and I very much appreciate all these people doing that for me, because man, it wouldn't work otherwise. Depends on the book. Like sometimes I just sketch the map just to kind of like vaguely understand it. For something like Thousand Names, where it's all about sort of armies marching from place to place, the
Yeah.
maps are more important because I need to know how long it takes to get from point A to point B. For Spelljammer, for example, it just sort of hand waved, like it's all speed of plot. Uh,
Nothing wrong with that. Did you
J. Michael
play?
Straczynski famously said that the White Stars travel at the speed of plot in Babylon 5, because none of the travel times in that show make any
No,
sense.
they don't. Did you play a lot of, because you did a Magic the Gathering book.
Mhm.
Did you play Magic the Gathering? Did you do any of
I
that?
did. Ironically, the same problem. I played Magic mostly in high school, some in college. Um, I played a lot back in the day, but had mostly stopped. I don't even have any of my stuff anymore.
I bet you wish
By
you
the
did.
time, what?
Just to sell.
No, that's not true. I sold a lot of it for pretty reasonable prices. I was never like, the Black Lotus guy.
Right, right, right.
Uh, but but yeah, like um so I knew enough about it, although I had to read up on all the new lore.
Okay.
Like I quit before they started the kind of modern version of the magic lore.
Yeah.
Um and so that was all interesting to me. I hadn't been keeping up with it at all, and so I went through a lot of their reference material and sort of read their books and their web fiction, and they have like art references. So that was a lot of fun, but at least it was good because I understood the sort of basic concepts. The
Yeah.
rules have changed a little bit, but not too much.
When they were asking you to do a book like that, have you done other tie-in books before that, tie-in fiction books, or was that kind of like your first? And did they kind of structure, be like, this is what we want, this is what we need?
That I think that was the first tie-in I did, the Magic the Gathering one. And their structure is very interesting. They have a kind of vague idea of what the story should be like, but it's surprisingly malleable.
Okay.
Um, I went in with some ideas, they came in and they're like, this is what it is. And it was more collaborative than I thought. I really thought I'd come in and get my marching orders and then just write those chapters.
Yeah.
Um, but there are certain things that are set in stone and not always the big character beats or story beats. Like they'll say, okay, well, we have this guy in the story and we think he might be a good guy or a bad guy, like whatever. But at some point, he has to stand on a bridge and hand somebody else a sword. And it's because some artist has been drawing that for the last 3 months.
Yeah.
So, like, that has to happen. But
Yeah.
the context is completely changeable. Um, it's just a result of like the magic story guys are very dedicated, but like it's clearly the game is the driver and the story sort of follows it.
Yeah.
And so like nothing stops the train of a new set coming out in stores because millions and millions of dollars are at stake.
Yeah.
uh, the kind of fiction that they publish on their website has to make do with whatever they've got. And so the fixed points are like the art on the cards because like that gets locked in way early,
Right.
much more so than the fiction does.
Okay. So tell your story about how kind of magic, because you right at the beginning you were kind of hinting at that. How did Magic the Gathering in that book kind of lead into the Spelljammer novel that we have now that's coming out on Tuesday?
Oh, so I did a couple of magic stories. I did Ravnica pre-War of the Spark, um, and then Ikoria. And that was fun, and I got to sort of know the people over at WotC. Um, and then I wasn't we talked a little bit about doing some other stuff, but it didn't quite come together. But at some point I said, hey, apropos of nothing, if you guys ever need Spelljammer fiction, call me because I love Spelljammer.
Yeah.
And it turned out they were doing Spelljammer. I had no idea they were re-releasing the set at that point.
Right. Was this
And
before
so
the fifth edition book came out? I'm
yeah,
assuming.
yeah,
Okay.
that hadn't even been announced.
Okay.
So like this was years and years ago, and I was like, but Paul, who's my contact there, was like, I knew we were doing Spelljammer, so I'm like, God, I gotta hold my tongue. Um, uh, and then so when it came out, they called me and were like, you want to do a novel for this? They had actually offered me another book. I forget which universe it was in. I think maybe Forgotten Realms. Which I said no because I just don't know enough about Forgotten Realms. It's not a setting that I'm that embedded in.
Yeah.
And there's just been so much done in that setting, it's hard to do it justice
Right.
if you're not like already a fan. One of the wonderful things about Spelljammer is that it's it's like so expansive that you can always just sort of make up your own system and set your thing there, and it has you have all the trappings, you have the ships and the races
Right.
and all that stuff, but you don't have like you know 20 years of gaming history and 700 novels all already
Right.
set there that like you really should know about.
Did you have anything that tied into any of the past novels, or even like nodded towards the past novels, or anything like that?
The novels, no. I sort of deliberately didn't reread them because like it feels like that's too deep of a cut because they're actually kind of hard to get now. I don't think there are ebook versions.
Yeah.
So like that didn't seem like a good use of my time. There's definitely some stuff in there kind of nodding to or alluding to things from the old set,
Okay.
or some of the other supplements because like the new set they only have so much room, so they
Yeah.
didn't like put in everything from the old sets.
Yeah.
Um, and so some of that stuff that was cool, I either added in directly or there's just like hints at it.
Yeah. Because people love Easter eggs, right? They love Easter eggs.
Right, yeah. Well, and those at least you can get them as PDFs and you could read them if you want to. The old second edition stuff. Um, yeah, those. It's interesting reading through the old sets because like there's so much cool like lore, but a lot of the crunch is kind of unusable.
Yeah.
Like there's this whole tactical starship maneuvering system that like I really struggle to see how anyone ever actually used. It just like wasn't that usable. I remember struggling with it and eventually giving up, back when I had all the time in the universe to spend
Right.
on D. Um, but so Yeah.
Okay.
Um, but it was definitely a nostalgia trip going through all these things. You're like, oh, I remember this.
So much like Magic, did they say this is what we need, this is what they want, or were they like, you came to us, give us something? Did they give you
We
carte blanche or?
I had a very free hand for this. I had written something for them previously, some sort of character designs that never really saw the light of day. And they were like, we loved some of these designs, and so maybe you could use some of those characters. And so I did that. Um, but other than that, not really. There wasn't much, guidance from their side other than, work in the stuff that's in the set, obviously. And also that it should definitely be fifth edition, which is important that they said that to me because like I haven't played that much fifth edition.
Right.
So um, I had to sometimes write with my player's handbook sitting next to me because like otherwise I'd get the spells wrong
Yeah.
and remember some third edition version. Uh, but so
I do
and
that when I'm
fortunately,
gaming. So,
yeah, exactly. Fortunately, you don't have to write the book live, and so I had editors on their side who would help me with that.
yeah.
Um, but at least in theory, all the spell effects and stuff are sort of recognizable from the books. Uh, but other than that, not really. And I just they were like, okay, pitch us, and I basically was like, well, if I were going to do Spelljammer, we have to do Space Pirates because Space Pirates are awesome, and
Right. Right.
kind of went from there. And that was it. And they were totally cool with it. The story that is in the book is basically just what I pitched.
Yeah. You mentioned a little earlier about how, right now when it comes to D&D, it's pretty much like R.A. Salvatore was doing it then and is doing it now. But there's not a lot of D&D novels. There haven't been, other than, they came out with the movies and the movies had
Yeah,
two books with them. And other than that, this is kind of the first non-Salvatore, non-Dragonlance book that
yeah.
Wizards of the Coast is putting out in a very long time. How is that for you to know that you're one of the first in this
It's
new?
super exciting. It's definitely different from when I was doing Magic, where it was just kind of like one in a long line of things. I hope the book holds up. It does add some pressure, but I'm excited about it. Um, and I think at least when they talk to me about it, I don't have any corporate inside information, but the goal was to do more of this going forward. So I don't know how much, I don't know if I'll do anything more for them. They haven't asked. We'll see how the book goes. But I would imagine there's other stuff in development that's going to come out.
Yeah.
I can, I can't be telling tales out of school on that because I don't actually know, but like that would make sense to me.
Well, I hope that the book does awesome. There's something on
Yeah,
the
me too.
inside of it that I have to ask you about because you have a dedication to all of your high school friends. And I have to ask you, people,
Oh,
when you get the book, you're going to see it and know. Tell me the story about the fat mayors.
oh no.
did,
Uh, um,
did you think nobody was going
I'm
to?
gonna tell the story wrong because this became like a running gag in our Rifts group
So preface it
30
with it's
years
an inside
ago.
joke. You might not remember it. It was a long time ago,
It is
but
a
you'll tell
long
the
time
best you
ago.
can.
It was it was my friend Gary, um, who I'm trying to remember exactly what happened, but um, we were in some little town and uh, there was there was a the fat mayor of the town who turned out to be kind of like a scumbag and like tried to rip us off. See, my friends, I'm gonna say this and my friends are gonna call me and tell me I'm getting it wrong. But like um
Then you just have to
but
come back on and retcon it later down the road.
yeah, and then I think what happened was that Gary like obliterated the guy in an extremely disproportionate way. Like he was just like some normal guy who was getting mad, and Gary, who was playing like a power armor jockey, like fired a volley of missiles at him and just like completely vaporized him. And it just became this watchword for like disproportionate violence.
Okay.
Um yeah. That was that was a weird one.
Do they know that little dedication, that little snippet is in the
I
book?
don't think this may be the first to hear about it. I don't know
Okay.
how many of the old crew have gotten my books yet. I mean, it's not out yet, so I guess none of
Yeah.
them have.
Yeah. Well, hopefully
Uh,
they get it, and hopefully they see it, and you get a phone call and be like, "Hey, wait a second."
yeah, I'll have
If
to send
nothing
one
else, now
my
they
way.
for sure they'll hear this and they'll be like, "Dang it!
Yeah,
Now I got to
that's
get the
true.
dang book." And
It's true. Well, if I get the correct story, Luke, my friend Luke would know. Then I'll post it on my Twitter if you want the true Fat Mayor
there we
story,
go. There we go. You
as
do a little
opposed to
blurb
my
on
kind
Blue
of like
Sky on
garbled
Twitter.
recollection of it. It's funny. I'm still in touch with so many people from that old group. Thank goodness for the internet age when I don't have to just like never see the people I went to high school with again. I
Right.
mean, that's not true. 99% of the people I went to high school with, I'm very happy to never see again. But like the 10 of them who were in my role playing group.
Yeah, your close group. Let's talk about your upcoming. You've got another book coming. You just had a book, right? I didn't even
Yes,
mention it. I didn't even
I
mention it. People in chat are
just had a
talking
book.
about it. Um, your book that just came out. Tell us a little bit
Yes,
about that. It's the
it's
How to Become a Dark Lord, right?
yeah, How to Become the Dark Lord and Die Trying. And this one, I hope there's a lot of crossover between these two because they're both very tabletop RPG kind of inspired or video game inspired. Obviously, SpellJammer Memories Wake is literally a D&D book. But How to Become the Dark Lord is about um, a girl who's trapped in a time loop where she gets told by an old wizard that she has to become the savior of the kingdom and defeat the Dark Lord. But every time she fails and dies, and the Dark Lord takes over, and every time she dies, she restarts the time loop. And after 1,000 years of this, she decides that she's done with it and she's going to become the Dark Lord instead. And so she goes about going into the forest and recruiting monsters to form a horde and become the Dark Lord. Um, and it's kind of a dark fantasy comedy. There's like a lot of role playing game humor in there,
Yeah,
because you know, obviously in many ways her references are my references, and so there's a lot of of D&D jokes and video game jokes.
that's
Um,
great.
so I hope people who are here for the D&D books will enjoy it as well.
Okay. And then your next book after Spelljammer, you've got
Yes,
another
yes.
one coming out because you're just knocking them out of the park
It's
here.
crazy. Well, it's funny. Like Dark Lord took forever to come out. It took like almost 2.5 years because of like COVID shenanigans.
Right.
Um, and so it's like everything has just kind of like lined up. So everything's coming out this year. I only had one release last year. But yes, I have a book called Last Stop that's coming out in October. And it's about a world in which humans can only live on mountaintops because everything below a certain altitude is dominated by gigantic killer insects. And so the humans live on the mountaintops and travel around in flying ships and diesel powered airplanes. Um, and not diesel powered airplanes. They're powered by whatever. Doesn't matter. World War II airplanes.
Right.
Um, and it's about a mercenary company that goes on a job that's too good to be true, and how it turns out that in fact it is.
Okay. Okay.
It's
Sounds
very
good.
it's supposed to be it's relatively short. It's supposed to be the first in a series of kind of short pulpy novels. Um, Going forward, I'm doing at least one more of those. Um, and so that should be fun. The other thing I'd mention, if for the D&D crowd, if you go to my website, which is djangowexler.com, and sign up for my newsletter, you get a free novella called Horde. And Horde is the story of an adventuring party that uh, defeats a dragon on the first page and finds a giant pile of treasure. And then the story is them attempting to get the treasure back to civilization because it turns out that gold is really heavy. um,
I
they
love
don't
it.
have a they don't have a bag of holding or anything, and so uh, trying to fight their way through bandits and various other things, bankers, um, and it's kind of also a little bit comedic, but kind of a quick fantasy story. So anyway, sign up for my newsletter, and I'll tell you about new releases, and you can have that for free.
Awesome. That's great. I love it. I love it. You have an upcoming appearance coming up later this week. You're going to be
I
joining our
do.
our good friend Aaron Evans. If you don't know Aaron
Yes.
Evans, guys, go and check out that podcast episode.
Yes, her books are
Erin's an
wonderful.
amazing author. Relics of Ruin just came out not too long ago, her second book. So you will be joining her on Wednesday, June 5th at Third Place Books in Seattle, right? Tell us
Yep.
a little bit about that. How did that come to be? Did they call you? Was it just kind of set up that you'd both be there?
I think the publisher set it up. They were trying to set up events, and we both live in this area here in Seattle, and we both had similar um, releases. You know, hers is coming up soon. Mine just happened. So I think it's been on my schedule forever. So I may be making this up, but I'm pretty sure they set that up.
Okay.
I love Third Place Books. They're like one of several really good indie bookstores around here. So I'm excited to do that.
Yeah, it'll be super cool. And you get to hang out with Erin. It'll be, two
Yeah.
D&D authors getting together because you're a D&D
This,
author now, right? You're
yeah,
on that illustrious list.
I know. This will be at the Lake Forest Third Place. There are several locations. This is the big one up in Lake Forest. I think it starts at 7 o'clock, but go to their website, they'll have all the details.
Awesome. That's cool. People can find you on Twitter as well. Twitter
Yep.
/X at Django Wexler
I will never
DJA.
call it X.
right. I have to. That's what they're called now. I say both. At DJANGO Wexler WEXLER. That is how it is spelled. At Django Wexler on Twitter /X. Also at djangowexler.bsky yada 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 for Blue Sky with the big long string. Hopefully they fix that.
Search for at Django Wexler.
Yeah, at Django Wexler, it'll pop up on
That's
there.
me.
So go ahead.
And DjangoWexler.com is my website, which has the newsletter book I mentioned, plus all information on all the things that I'm doing.
Yep. Just find the information on pre-orders there. I know Amazon has pre-orders too. You can do through there, and audio. Your books are on bunch of your books are on audiobook. I know I've got the SpellJammer Memories Wake on Audible, just waiting to go. Just waiting. It'll auto download as soon as it's live, and I'll be listening to it.
I haven't heard that one yet, so I hope it's really good. It usually is. They usually get good narrators for me.
Do you sometimes get to choose your narrator or talk to your narrator ahead of time?
It just completely depends on the schedule and the company and what they're doing. For Memories Wake, I didn't have any input. They didn't even talk to me. I think they may have asked me for a list of pronunciations, and that's about it.
Okay.
They usually do that. I tell you, you never feel sillier as a fantasy author than when somebody sends you just like a list of every name that you made up, and you just have to read them into a mic one after another. Makes you feel very silly. But like in contrast for Dark Lord, that one's a tricky record for several reasons. Like there's footnotes and it's just a strange voice. So there I did work a little more closely with the audiobook people, and the result I think is really good. But most of that's handled, like audiobook production is a kind of specialist thing, and they have really talented people who do it. So my hat is off to them. It's always been great.
Awesome. Again, people, you can get SpellJammer Memories Wake Tuesday, June 4th. For us live, that's tomorrow. If you're listening to the podcast, it's today. So go and check that out.
It's already out.
It's already out. Go get it. Django, thank you so much for being here today. I appreciate it. We're going to get to the live stream Q&As here in just a little bit. For those of you in the live stream, go ahead and throw those in the chat. But for those that are listening to the podcast, I want to let you know, speaking of D&D books, June 17th, we're going to be joined by an Epic Realms alumni and friend of the show. Richard Lee Byers is going to be coming back. We're going to catch up with him since his last time he was on here and the last time he joined us. We're going to talk more about his Marvel books, kind of how those have turned out, how Heimdall's going, and all of the stories for Marvel. We'll probably talk some more D&D as well, and whatever else he's got going on. So he's going to be joining us on June 17th. That podcast will be available on June 18th. Again, all kinds of D&D stuff down the road. We're going to also be having James Lauder is going to be joining us. He did some Ravenloft books, all kinds of other books, so he's going to be joining us. Actor Mark Meir, you might know him from Call of Cthulhu, the new show that they're doing. He is also, the voice of Shepard in video games and many other video games as well. So you definitely want to join us for that. Leanne Merciel is going to be joining us. So lots and lots of guests. So please rate, review, follow, subscribe, all of those things. It helps us and helps all of our guests. So please tell your friends, spread the word about the show. So for Django Wexler, I am Nick, and I want to thank you all for listening to Epic Realms.